Good morning, friends, and welcome to a countdown to his coming. It's our Saturday episode that we always use to point to prophetic fulfillments in Scripture along with current events of our time. And as we're looking at that, I hearken back to what we've been doing this week in Wake Up in the Word. We've been going through the book of Revelation, and this past week we were in two chapters of Scripture, chapters 17 and 18. Chapters that talk about the great mystery Babylon, its reason for judgment, and its ultimate destruction, which will happen apparently at the end of the tribulation period. What I want to ask today is, do we have a city on planet Earth that matches 100% of the description of both of those chapters? Now, I love to hear the people try to talk about how chapter 17 is one Babylon and chapter 18 is another Babylon, and they split them apart as if they're two separate entities. Oh no, I think it goes all the way back to ancient Babylon. They are connected, they are interwoven. You cannot separate them. They're talking about some different ways that Babylon influences the world, yes, from a religious perspective, but is there a place that pulls all of this together that we could say is like the modern day Babylon that will deserve the destruction described in Revelation chapter 18? And I'm going to go way out on that limb today because, kind of like Santa Claus, I've been making a list and checking it twice, taking names and looking at what places on planet Earth could fulfill every single one of these things, because you can't have one missing. It's got to be complete. And to my shock and amazement, I think we do have that place identified. Now, I know many folks who believe as I do on this, but they're just not willing to say so publicly. So I'm the one going to stick my foot in it this morning and let you know exactly what I think. And of course, you can let me know what you think. But what do we read about in Revelation 17 and 18? A city that has the power to influence the world. It's the seat of international influence. And yes, that's the kind of city that ancient Babylon proposed to be, spreading not just its military might, but its religion, its worship of the ancient demonic gods that we will name here shortly. What about this city? It is, number one, a promoter of sexual immorality. We saw that at the very beginning of chapter 17. It continues. Secondly, they're a center of commerce and wealth for the entire world. But her sins are piled up to heaven, it said. There's also worldwide relationships emanating from this city that are both economic and political. This city's engaged in every kind of commerce, including, as we saw in Revelation 18:13, human trafficking. Sixthly, there's a symbol here. This city is the symbol of wealth, riches, and popular culture for the entire world. And the connections to Revelation 17 cannot be dismissed. There we have described for us a notorious prostitute, as it says in the Christian Standard Bible, who promotes sexual immorality and the destruction of society. In chapter 17, verse 5, it said, on her head is this statement, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and of the vile things of the earth. When you look into ancient history, there are many of these female and male to female gods and goddesses that are represented. The one that stands out the most, and the name we would be most familiar with, is Ishtar. Ishtar. And you would think that a city that's going to be destroyed based on this identification with Ishtar would probably have a giant monument to her right within its borders. You would also think that the other gods represented, like Baal, would also have some monuments to them within the borders of this particular city. We see how her judgment comes, and it's pretty drastic. Matter of fact, in chapter 18, it goes from saying in one day to literally saying in 1 hour. That kind of gives us a hint. Could it be that this city will be targeted by an enemy that despises her to no end. And it would not take large armies and multiple weeks of siege to destroy this city. Oh no, in our day, it would take only one nuclear device set off at the right height above that city to wipe it out, to set the fires burning, to see it totally destroyed. Now, you and I are the only generation, if you're in that baby boomer generation post-World War II, that has grown up in this age where these kind of weapons are even available. And though we have thousands of them across the planet now in a growing number of nations, to destroy this city, it would take only one. What a terrible way to lose such a tremendous, gigantic place of influence. But that's what it seems like the book of Revelation is telling us is going to happen to this city at the end of the tribulation. Now, what city do I think that might be? You might already have some hints in your own mind just by the description that we have in Revelation 17 and 18. You can find some of these characteristics in other cities around the world, but the one that fits 100% of them is none other than New York City in the United States of America. And if you look at what has happened in this generation, here's how it has changed. In the year that I was born, in New York City, 3 gigantic crosses were imposed on skyscrapers to celebrate Easter. It was a place that was considered to be a center of Americanized Christian culture in the world. Yes, it was turning quite liberal in that direction, but it was still considered the chief gateway to this Christian nation as viewed by other nations in the world. Oh, how it has changed. In recent days, illuminated across the skyscrapers of New York City have been the wicked images of pagan gods. Is that an accident? I think not. Now, I'm going to call your attention to a book I'm going to be quoting from today by Jonathan Cahn. It's entitled Return of the Gods. This is one you can pick up CBD, a number of other places. And yes, some of you may immediately flinch and say, well, he's not a part of my denomination, and I don't read books from people that aren't in my camp. Well, God bless you. You're missing out on the evidence that we're going to be looking at today. And you can get it in much greater detail from this Messianic rabbi that's done an awful lot of research into this and has pointed us to all the harbingers and the follow-up of God's pointing out that our nation is going to fall under his judgment if we do not repent. And yet our nation not only has not repented, it has increased its drive toward immorality, toward rejecting God, and toward paganism. I'm going to call your attention to what's been happening in New York City just recently. Please stick with me. You do not want to miss this evidence. First of all, let's talk about the worship of Baal, something that's quite evident in New York City now and across our culture. The folks would not admit that that's what they're doing, but they have all the signs and the symbols, and more than you would think about. For example, in the ancient temple of Baal, connecting the two is a giant archway, the Arch of Palmyra. Now, what's interesting as we read this passage is what has been done in New York City to demonstrate its worship of Baal just recently. Well, Cahn writes that it was in New York City which stood America's modern equivalents to the temples of Baal. Its houses and monuments of materialism, increase, and gain. It could even be said that New York City was itself a spiritual temple of Baal. And even the location of the arch within the city was significant. What am I talking about? This mysterious arch appeared in New York City. It was brought shrouded in white cloth so no one could actually see it, a massive, nearly 11-ton monument made of Egyptian marble, rising nearly 20 feet from the ground. It was an arch, a massive recreation of the arch that led to the Temple of Baal. It had appeared in London, would later appear in other Western cities, including our own capital, Washington, D.C. But the appearance of the arch that had served as the entranceway to Baal's temple in New York City was especially significant, for New York City had played a central role in America's apostasy from God and in many ways served as the capital of that fall. It had functioned as a conduit for Baal's entrance into American civilization. So what did they do with this gigantic arch? It was erected in Lower Manhattan at the entrance of the city's financial district. Nearby was Wall Street, the New York Stock Exchange, and the other sign of Baal, that molten bull of Wall Street. Yes, a bull was an ancient symbol of Baal worship. As the Arch of Palmyra once stood as the entranceway to the Temple of Baal, the arch in New York City now stood at the entranceway to America's temples of Baal. And as the ancient arch had connected Baal's temple with the city's main avenue, the recreated arch stood by New York City's most famous, the main avenue, Broadway, the modern equivalent to the great colonnade at Palmyra. So too did the molten bull. The two symbols of Baal were now joined. The specific site chosen for the arch was also significant. It was erected on the grounds of City Hall, New York City's central seat of government, and the city officials would take part in its unveiling. Now, what did that unveiling look like? If you're in other parts of the world, you didn't even know this happened, unless you read one of the news articles. What was this ceremony like? Well, on the morning of September the 19th, 2016, New Yorkers gathered around the arch for a special event, its unveiling, its presentation. By the arch stood a sign placed there by the event sponsors on which the name of Baal appeared. Among the speakers at the unveiling was the city's deputy mayor, who described the erection of the arch as an act of defiance. Providing the ambiance for the event was a band playing Middle Eastern music, evocative of the sounds that would have accompanied the music played in the ancient times in the Temple of Baal. It was to those Middle Eastern sounds that the massive sheet covering the object was pulled away and the arch was revealed to the applause of the gathered spectators. I could go on about this because this arch was also taken to Washington, D.C., unveiled there. Just symbols, right? That's all it is. Symbols of something that really don't matter in this day. Or is it really an unveiling of what has happened to American culture? Well, as we look at what has been representative in New York City all during this time, we can't miss the fact that New York is the center of this pagan new worldwide religion that glorifies man and destroys all the norms that make up the typical family described in the Bible. Nothing can really point this out more than this between the worship of Baal and Ishtar, how much New York City has played a part in this. In particular, I'll read from one of the chapters of this book entitled The Sacred Prostitute, the subtitle being The Porn Goddess. Among the oldest writings in the world and history are the sacred hymns to Ishtar, in which she is described as a prostitute. The Greek word for this writing is graphos, and the Greek word for Ishtar's profession, prostitution, is porne. It is from this root, writings about a prostitute, that we get the word pornography. Thus, by literal definition of the word, pornography was birthed in the sacred writings of this ancient goddess. And so as the spirit of the prostitute goddess moved upon America, America became filled with pornography, meaning it's prostituting itself. American culture, entertainment, and American-produced internet made pornography ubiquitous. It was everywhere. Americans no longer had to go into the red light district of American cities and towns to obtain pornographic materials. American culture had now become a red light district. Ishtar had triumphed. Her effect on America was so great that it had now become the world's leading creator and exporter of pornography. America was now, in fact, producing the majority of the world's pornographic content. It had become the undisputed porn capital of the world. Now, there are lots of things you want to put on your resume to say you're best at. Hey, wow, I've had such great achievements. I can't imagine this one being something you'd want to brag about. But that's exactly what has emanated from our nation, and its capital is New York City. He goes on to write, the civilization that had been consecrated at its inception to advancing the gospel and spreading the light of God to the nations was covering the earth now with pornography and advancing the agenda of another spirit, that which now controlled it. That's the spirit of the prostitute goddess. Wow. You could go on and read about this in his book in all these chapters about what Ishtar does to society. But I want you to understand how far this goes. It goes farther than our own shores and our own country. It's the influence that American pornography has had on the world. An influence that's particularly disturbing because it's so hard to counter because of the power of the internet. And if you start shutting down the internet, of course, then, you're a problem. That's free speech. You should be able to freely let any information get out there, even if it destroys your culture. And thus, we have the seat of that wickedness right here in the United States of America. We could go on about this, but let's talk about how this has worked systematically to destroy our own nation and its ability to even reproduce and be the culture that spreads good news around the world. And one of the key elements of that is abortion. Abortion was promoted first and foremost with the very first cases against it in the first places it was legalized being, guess where? New York City. And thus we have the ancient god Molech demanding the sacrifice of our children once again appearing, and that has grown to where it's now a cultural phenomenon that's far more than just whether someone has a right to choose, which is the famous mantra. But instead, we have run into an entirely different picture, one that the promoters of abortion aren't afraid to describe for you. Now, back to Jonathan Cahn's book, he talks about the priests of Molech and how the Greek philosopher Plato even wrote of how Carthaginian culture viewed child sacrifice. He quotes, with us, for instance, human sacrifice is not legal but unholy, whereas the Carthaginians perform it as a thing they account holy and legal. So the Carthaginians not only legalized the practice, they deemed it as holy. Now, even this ancient dynamic was replayed in America and the modern world. The killing of an unborn child was not only legal, but now hallowed as a sacred right to be praised, celebrated, and venerated as something beautiful and sacrosanct. In ancient Israel, it was the priests of Molech and Baal who would hallow the murder of children by speaking of it in religious terms. Who then are the modern day priests of Molech? Are they the ones who perform the act and those who sanctify it, the corporations that profit from children's blood, the political leaders and legislators who fight to ensure that Molech's temples remain overflowing with offerings, and the radical activists and ideologues who speak blessings and praises over this savage act as they lead women to the altars? Well, listen to some scary quotes, not from Christian preachers, but from others. The following are some of the actual words spoken by those who sanctify the killing of unborn children. And notice the framing of the act in religious and spiritual terms, as well as the word sacrifice. Some of these quotes come from, for example, Jeanette Paris, who writes about something entitled The Sacrament of Abortion. That's right, to use sacrament and abortion in the same sentence, to me, is grotesquely perverted, but that's what her writing is all about. another woman named Sarah Terzo. Now just listen to some of these quotes. See what you think. Do you feel the religious element in this? First from Jeanette, our culture needs new rituals as well as laws to restore abortion to its sacred dimension. There's a sacred dimension to killing unborn children. Well, apparently. She goes on to write, it is not immoral to choose abortion. It is simply rather a kind of morality. A kind of morality? Yes, but she admits, quote, a pagan one. Oh, so now it's time for pagan morality to come into the picture. How about this quote? Abortion is a major blessing and a sacrament in the hands of women. Here we go with the religious terms again. And then abortion is a sacrifice, and abortion is a sacred act. Again, all quotes from abortion promoters, connecting it to some kind of religious ritual. Cahn writes, there's nothing else needing to be written here. Nothing could in any way add to or take away from the significance or horror of such words. But there was a specific place in ancient Israel where this mystery of Molech was centered, and it came to its most dramatic conclusion, and it would usher in the nation's judgment. So he goes on to talk about what took place in the Valley of Hinnom. Do we have a modern-day Valley of Hinnom right here in the United States of America, a place where we brag about, if you can't find legal abortion where you are, come to this place. We will make sure you can kill your baby here legally, safely, and in feeling good about yourself. And that the capital of that place is, guess where? It's New York City. But listen, as we go on, it's not just in taking the lives of the unborn that New York City is famous for, but in promoting this new culture that completely strips away masculinity from men, femininity from women, and confuses us in every possible way. There are many examples I could give you out of this book from it, but I want to talk about this one where he's really getting into the identity of Ishtar as a god who's a goddess who can transform herself into a himself back and forth, male to female and female to male. The whole point is to promote this new idea of transsexuality. He even has a paragraph I'd like to read for you from his book about Ishtar's storybook hour. He says that if little children were not already sufficiently confused as to their sexual identities, they could now be brought to the public library, where a man wearing lipstick, false eyelashes, mascara, high heels, a wig, and a dress formed to simulate a woman's anatomy would read to them their favorite children's storybooks. And they had once ministered as priests in the temples of Ishtar. Now they ministered to children in public libraries. In an ancient Hittite prayer, Ishtar is described as possessing the power to, quote, make young women dress as men on their right side and to make young men dress as women on their right side, on their left side, So the spirit of Ishtar now again made young women dress as men and young men dress as women and both dress as both and as neither. A strange spirit was now leading the culture in which adults now seemed to take great delight in encouraging children to take on the dress and attributes of the opposite gender. Now, I could go on and read about this, the return of the gala priest and all the other things that go with it, but we could be here all day just talking about that. Friends, where did this come from? It started right there in New York City. And it started back in a day in which there was a dramatic event that took place. It's called the Stonewall Riot or the Stonewall Rebellion. It happened at a bar in New York City where all of a sudden, possessed with anger and distrust over what was happening with the local police on a raid at a gay bar, that suddenly these people took up in angry response the the ability to rebel against the culture of the day. When this particular event took place in 1969, it's like it possessed a new culture that would now promote these perverted ways of sexuality across our culture. And it's no accident that they decided to do it with parades. Yes, the very first of these came before us, as it was called, a Stonewall Parade. It would happen in some other places, but it would start because of the Stonewall riot in New York City. It would start there. It's amazing how that connects to some Stonewall incidents in ancient history with these pagan gods now brought full force into our times. On June the 28th, 1970, the one-year anniversary of the Stonewall riots, the participants gathered in Greenwich Village near Stonewall to begin the Christopher Street Liberation Day March, the name taken from the street on which the riots erupted. Beginning with a few hundred participants, the march proceeded up 6th Avenue, where it swelled to a few thousand before reaching its destination at Central Park. Now, as planned, the parade would be repeated every summer and as an annual observance. With each passing year, more marches would be held in more cities across America than across the world, first called Gay Liberation Marches, then Gay Pride Parades, and now simply Pride Parades. They all took place at the same time of the year to commemorate the uprising that brought them into existence. The first march in Los Angeles down Hollywood Boulevard also came to identify its connection to Stonewall and its western extension. Many of the pride parades and festivals in Europe were even called the same thing. All the Pride Day parades, marches, processions, and festivals had as their birthplace Stonewall. Could even this go back to an ancient mystery? Now, the short answer is yes. I'll let you read about it in Jonathan Cahn's book, but it's amazing how these things connected and have come on down to our times. So that what has happened in this month of June, the month of Tammuz, the month that is filled with ancient pagan rebellion against God, it all happens in the exact same month and toward the end of June. So what happens when you see this come to its fullness in the 21st century? Well, toward the end of June, we discover everything that has come from Stonewall and from this rebellion against God's morality has led to every other collapse of our society. The first door that Cahn points out is the legalization of homosexuality. This came with the case of Lawrence versus Texas in 2003. It resulted in the Supreme Court decision that legalized homosexuality throughout the United States. It will be cited later the same year by the Massachusetts Supreme Court in the ruling that legalized same-sex marriage in that state. When did this happen? It happened June the 26th, 2003. Watch the connection to June. The second door, of course, overturning the Defense of Marriage Act, happened with the United States versus Windsor in 2013. When this ruling that overturned the Defense of Marriage Act was handed down, it was when? Toward the end of June, during the same times of those Tammuz pagan festivals, handed down in that ancient month, June the 26th, 2013. It goes on. What about the third door, the overturning of marriage itself, the redefinition? Well, the third door was forced open in the Supreme Court case that was celebrated in 2015, June the 26th, 2015. Marriage as the covenant of a man and a woman was struck down on that date, the same exact date that the Defense of Marriage Act was overturned in 2013. My goodness, all three of these landmark events that pushed open the ancient door to paganism took place on the exact same date. And on top of that, each was the anniversary of the date Stonewall was sealed which was the beginning of the opening of that door. We could go on and talk about this. Where's the ancient door been opened to this paganism, to the destruction of our families, to the glorification of immoral sexual practices? It all came from one place, New York City. That's one of the reasons why I believe that the identification of Mystery Babylon, the place from where all this poison emanates, is right here on our own shores, which tells me that it's all the more important for us to minister with the fine people of New York right now so that as many as possible can come to know Christ before this ultimate destruction at the end of the tribulation. You know, right now there are some tremendous churches in New York City. Sue and I have been there to minister on mission trips. We just had a group come back to our own association ministering in New York City. There are great churches there. There's Brooklyn Tabernacle, there's Times Square Church, Graffiti Church. I could name oodles of them. We have a Metropolitan New York Baptist Association working in all 5 boroughs. There are many good Christian people there. But my question for you is this. As the gospel right now is being proclaimed in this now seat of paganism right here on our own shores, the seat of the United Nations, which deceives the entire earth and tries to build that ancient Babylonian empire that was described in Genesis. When we look at this, what, my friends, will happen to that city when God's people come out of it? Just as Lot's family was taken out of Sodom and Gomorrah before its ultimate judgment by fire, would there be anything to hold back that judgment 1 second after the rapture of the church? God has promised that we, who are part of His kingdom and His family, will not see His wrath on this planet. But what is to hold that wrath back after the rapture of the church occurs? My friends, there is no reason to think you will have second chances in New York City, because in this seat of rebellion against God, you've probably taken sides. You're on one side or the other of saying, I am for God and I'm standing for His principles and His church and for His word. Or, no, I'm against it. I'm one of those that mocks the Christians, that persecutes the Jews, and that stands here in defiance of everything that has been and will ever be God. Friends, for those who have taken that stand, there is nothing left after the rapture of the church but the ultimate judgment of Babylon the Great. And I believe as far as that may take place in many cities around the world after the rapture, I think the one that we can identify the most clearly from Revelation chapter 18 is actually New York City, the United States of America. Well, if you can have a great day after all that, you go for it. In the meantime, let's share the good news of the gospel while we can. And I'll see you next week for another countdown to His coming.